said, The Book Thief and Beyond with Markus Zusak. Markus Zusak, one of the most successful authors to come out of Australia, is the author of 5 books, including the international bestseller, The Book Thief, which spent more than a decade on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into more than 40 languages. His much anticipated new novel, Bridge of Clay, was released in October of 2018. In conversation with Markus will be Sandip Roy. Sandip is a novelist and journalist currently living in Kolkata. His first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title for the Asian Pacific American Literature Awards in the US and the Likho Award in India, and was listed for other major awards, including the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. If I may please call Markus and Sandip on stage. We need the mic. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sandip.
Okay, this is working. Hi, everybody, and welcome to day 1. This session is called Book Thief and Beyond. So I thought, and Markus, welcome to Kolkata.
Thank you.
Well, when the Book Thief came out, I read a quote from you where you said, it's set in Nazi Germany, it's narrated by death, almost everyone dies, and it's 580 pages long. I wouldn't buy it. So you now set a book in sort of suburban blue-collar Australia, as well as near a remote river in a remote part of Australia. It's again 580 pages long. It's narrated by a human, okay, not death, but what gives?
Well, before I even answer that, I think certain other really serious things need to be taken care of tonight, and that is, of course, I'm Australian, and I think there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are those who love cricket, and there are those who are totally ignorant. And so I have to say, congratulations to the Indian cricket team for what they just did in Australia. We're not totally graceless as a nation, so I had to say that. Of course it hurt. It still hurts. It's going to hurt forever. In fact, I don't know, it took a lot of guts to get on the plane and come to India. Everyone said, what are you doing? You're going to India. What, now? Now you're going now?
Will they allow you back?
Sorry, say
Will
again?
they allow you back in Australia?
There'll be some severe testing just to make sure I haven't been converted. But no, it's exciting to be here and amongst not only cricket lovers, but lovers of books as well. So to talk about The Book Thief and Bridge of Clay, I don't know what it is about 580-page books, but the next book is not going to be 580 pages, I promise you. And it's not going to take 13 years to write. I promise you that.
Well, when you mention 13 years, almost every article about Bridge of Clay begins with, it's been 13 years since The Book Thief. How old are your children?
12 and 8.
So they're younger than the time it took you to write this book. So what's their idea of what a writer does, what writing's all about?
Well, this is the, I've got at least 2 classic stories about that. But the first, and I don't know if I'll tell the second one, we'll see. But the first one, sort of in June last year, or June or July, I was doing the last edits for Bridge of Clay. And my 12-year-old daughter was sitting diagonally across from me at the kitchen table. And I don't know I can't speak for the children of India, but the children of Australia eat like barbarians. And she sat across from me, she was eating breakfast, and I said to her, can you keep it down over there? I'm trying to get some work done here. I'm doing this last edit. And she looked up mid sort of spoonful, and she looked at me and she went, you work? And I thought about this for a very long time, or that whole day. And then I thought, well, let's actually test this theory. And I realized I never count words in a book. I've never done that. It's always funny when I meet an author and they say, oh, I'm 60,000 words into my book. And I think, I'm sure that's probably pretty good. And but I counted how many words there are in Bridge of Clay. And I looked it up and it was something like 128,000 words. And then I calculated how many days there are in 13 years. And it turned out to be 1.9 words per day. Not even 2 words a day, not even 2. And I thought, well, she's got a point. And so I think my kids, the funny thing is, the funny thing is that my kids are much more invested in Bridge of Clay than they are in The Book Thief, because they saw that book getting made. And so now, my kids will say, at the beginning of The Book Thief, where it says death and chocolate, they just say, that's ridiculous. Whereas Bridge of Clay, they're a bit more open to, and I think because they feel like they have a part in it.
They'll probably write a memoir one day, growing up with the Bridge of Clay.
Oh, it's funny. Someone asked my daughter and my son, they said, oh, so do you think you're going to be a writer? And this is the other side. Finally, my daughter, she realized that's the difference between being at home and being in public. In public, she said, no, it looks like it's much too hard work for me to go into.
Or rather, in private, she's like, I am not writing 2 words for less than 2 words a year and hoping it'll finally add up to something. But, given that 1.9 words per year, per day, not per year, that would take a long time. For
per year would
sonnet.
be great. Yeah, that'd be a good life.
But did you not worry at any point that this would become sort of the great lifetime project? How did you keep faith that it would finish?
I wouldn't say I didn't. For whatever reason, this book was dead so many times. And I think every book you have that moment where you think, this isn't going to work. It just can't work. And then something happens where even when you're thinking that, you still think, of course I can do it. Of course I can do it. And that's because I'm a writer. And I can make things happen. And whatever problems there are, I remember when I was writing The Book Thief, I just had a little piece of paper. It was actually the back of a cartoon strip that I had every day you peeled off the calendar. And I just wrote on it, every problem has a simple solution. And you just think every book and its big problem that it is has just that's just interwoven with hundreds of tiny little problems. And you've just got to take those one by one. And so for whatever reason, I have the stupidity of an optimist when I'm writing a book. And even when this book was nowhere near seeing an end and where I was so low, and I went to my publisher and my agent, everyone had a meeting. It was like a crisis meeting. It was almost like an intervention. And I was acting, I even read the prologue and I was sitting there and I was reading it. And they all just said, for God's sake, you've just got to, it was like, pull yourself together and get this done. And so even then, when I was at my lowest point, I believed that I could do it.
But when in 2010 or something, when they sort of announced it as a Christmas release, I believe, and it had been budgeted for, and then you realize it's not going to happen. How did you deal with that and then telling that to your publisher?
It's one of the highlights of my career, is when there was in the newspaper at home, and it's not, the interesting thing is, and I'm not terribly interested in celebrity, I'm not interested in this, so I'm not reading the papers, I'm not interested in that kind of thing. But I did see in the newspaper that the Prime Minister of Australia of the time, I think in the time it took to write this book, there were 3 or 4 Prime Ministers, and some had been the Prime Minister twice. But John Howard, the Prime Minister, or who had been deposed, his book was coming out. And then, of course, in 2011, that next year, of course, John Howard's book came out and mine didn't. And so you could see the difference between someone who gets things done and someone who doesn't. And so I don't worry about those things. I mean, I worry because I'm letting everyone down. I'm letting my publisher down. Who's my friend? I'm letting my family down who, rely on me to put books out and also rely on me to be in a better mood because I'm finishing a book. And all of those things, but at the same time, the most important thing in all of those sentences is the book. And I will not put the book out unless it's the right book for and within itself. And so whatever accolade or criticisms this book gets, I wrote it to be the book that it needed to be.
When you finally realized that, okay, this is the book that can go out into the world, what did you do? What did that feel like?
Well, everyone thought, gosh, you must be ecstatic. You must be so excited. And of course, I look at them and say, oh, no, I'm feeling really flat. And that's because, writing that book, it was like writing for the World Championship of myself. It was everything. And, one of my favorite films, and this is showing my age now as well, but it is Chariots of Fire. And there's this great moment when Harold Abrahams wins the 100 metres at the 1924 Olympics, and you think he's going to be overjoyed, and he's miserable. He's in this pub or restaurant drowning his sorrows, and you think, what is he drowning his sorrows about? It's because he knows that the real joy was in the running. It was in that moment. It was in the striving. It was in how hard it was. That was the real beauty. And now he can only remember it. And so for me, I spent so much time with the 5 brothers in this book and their parents and even all of their strange animals. And so afterwards, I thought, it's typical of us humans, We're never happy with what we've got. I was miserable because I couldn't finish the book, and then I was miserable because I'd finished it. But I think you can probably see from my demeanour, that's not really that miserable. I just felt really happy that it was done and empty of the effort that it took. But I thought, gosh, how am I going to live without them? And I think that's how you should feel at the end of a book. How are you going to live without those characters being in your life?
After Book Thief's enormous success, you said something that I thought was very profound when you said, but when the doors open that wide, because people often say, oh, I don't let success bother me, books, I write the book for the pleasure of writing the book, whatever. But you said when the doors open that wide, a bit of darkness comes in through. What was that darkness?
I think it's everything. It starts. I think what happens is, and what I mean by that is, you get all of this kind of people. They give you money, and they give you suddenly you're selling books, and suddenly you're on the New York Times, and suddenly you're getting invited to places, and everyone loves you. But for everyone who loves you, there's going to be someone who doesn't love you. And they're very happy to tell you that they don't love you and that they don't like your writing. And so you will get criticisms, and sometimes it's years after you've finished the book. And I think now, you used to live in fear of critics writing, for the major newspapers like The Guardian or the New York Times. And you think, if I get a bad review there, that's the end of my career and possibly my life. Whereas now, it's not as much that. I mean, you still worry, but you've got more things to worry about, which is everyone can get onto their phone or their computer and they can tell you just how much they don't like you or appreciate your writing style or the way you speak or the way you read or the way... And so that's where it begins, with a little seed like that, and then you start to question everything. And then there are your own doubts and fears as well about your abilities, and you start to ask yourself, can I do it again? Can I do it again?
Writers' insecurity? God forbid.
And it's always the thing, the writers I most admire are always the ones I always mistrust. I'm always skeptical of the writer when that I meet. And I say, oh, how are you? How's it going? And they say, oh, this book I'm writing, it's my best one yet. I never trust those writers. The ones I want to read are the ones who look, a few steps short of suicidal. They're the ones I think, often I'll read their book and I just think, gosh, how could you have ever doubted yourself? So I think it's also... it's part of the game. And when I say game, I'm not talking about business or the idea of the trappings of any. What I mean, like the game, the struggle you have with yourself to get it done. And I think you're always wanting with every book to push yourself that little bit further, to write that little bit better. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think that's why the darkness that comes through the door is actually really healthy. Because if only light came through with any kind of success, there would be no meaning in it. And so I'm grateful. You don't feel grateful at the time when someone says, even, I don't know why, you look at a comment somewhere and it'll be, oh, sorry, Mum, I know you love this book, but I hated it. And if I could give this 0 stars, I would. But I have to give it 1 star or else I can't write this damning review. So I think what happens is this is all challenging you, and then what you have to do at some point is you say, why do I do this? Why did I start in the first place? And whether it's good, whether it's bad, you say, this is who I am, this is what I have to do, and you focus. And you focus very clearly on what you have to do, and that is to write that sentence that day that you didn't know you were going to write. And it's that beautiful sentence that you think, all right, I've done a good day's work today.
Well, you certainly pushed yourself in this book. It's about, as Markus said, 5 brothers who are growing up together, effectively raising themselves because their mother has died and the father has left. There's also, as he mentioned, a lot of animals, a mule, a goldfish, a cat, a dog, and a pigeon. And then one day the absent father comes back and says he needs their help to build a bridge. And while I was reading this, I thought, weirdly, did you guys grow up with Enid Blyton in Australia?
Yeah.
And so we all did here. And I thought, wow, in a weird way, this is like the darker or the more real version of the fantasy that was all through Enid Blyton, where kids got to live by themselves without grown-ups around. And in Enid Blyton, it was all about picnics and adventures and potted meat sandwiches, though in Kolkata we had no idea what that meant. Potted meat sandwiches and clotted cream and scones. And here you realize it's not quite that. How did you want to explore this idea of this large family that is effectively having to raise itself?
I'm never trying to say something, or I'm searching. I always feel like what I'm doing with work is I'm always searching. I'm searching for what I need and what I want. And half the time I'm going, well, that's not it. That's not it. And it's not quite it there. And then it's like with this book, I had the idea 23 years ago of a boy building a bridge and wanting to make it perfect and beautiful and great. And
why did you have that idea?
I don't know. I think
were you interested in bridges in general?
No. I didn't have any. But I think in a subliminal kind of way, I think I did. And I think you grow up in Sydney, and it's such a city of water that there are bridges everywhere. And of course, one of our great icons is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And so I think it's something, even now when I go to that part of the city, to Circular Quay in Sydney, you still stop as someone who grew up in the city, and you see it all the time, but you still stop when you go there and you look at that bridge and you look at the Opera House and you feel lucky to be alive that day. And so I also, through just learning, through studying history and everything, I was sort of attracted to the Roman way of building. And And so just the invention of the arch was such a genius thing. So I guess I did have a bit of an idea. And I just thought of a boy building, I didn't know what kind of bridge it was going to be, but it was going to be made of him. And that's where the idea of clay as the name came in. Or it was just the luck. The luck of the idea was that I named him Clayton.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was pure. Every book needs a little bit of luck. The Book Thief, it was the idea of, I just wrote from Death's point of view in a story in a school with some kids. And then I thought, oh, I might just put that in that book that I'm setting in Nazi Germany. The same way I had a girl stealing a book in modern day Sydney, one page of a story. And I thought, oh, I might just put that in that book that I'm setting in Nazi Germany. They were the two pieces of luck. And in this case, it was that his name was Clayton, which then brought the idea of bridge of clay and how he's moulding his whole life into that bridge. But to get back to that idea of why five brothers, why this transcending journey, I think it all just started to, it was what I needed. It was and I think what I wanted to do was I wanted to prove myself not only to the world but to myself. And so I thought, how could we make this book any more difficult? Let's not make it 2 brothers or 3 brothers. Let's make it 5. They don't have just a dog. They've got 5 pets, including a mule. And the one thing I'll say is that Bridge of Clay is almost written around, as we said when we met last night, is really written around that goddamn mule. And he's very important to the book.
Well, in other ways, you could say that you have to be as stubborn as a mule sometimes to be a writer, and that a mule-like quality is probably something a writer needs. But when you talk about these 5 brothers, there's a point in the book where the character says, did there really need to be 5 of us? And I wondered if that was you channeling sometimes the frustration of juggling so many people in one book.
I think having all those balls in the air was what attracted me to the idea as well. And there were times when you should see all the different versions of this book that there are. There are ones where there's a different narrator. I tried pretty much all of the brothers as the narrator. I tried their mum who has died, and I thought, you can't have death as the narrator.
Again.
And then a character who has died as the narrator. And but I never regretted the scope or the ambition of the book. And I just thought, this is it. Like, you want to be a writer. You want to, and you want to do better each time. And so you just think, when I wrote The Book Thief, I thought, what I'm going to do here, no one is going to read this book, bet everything. Take everything you've got, bet everything. And then I thought, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take The Book Thief and all the chips, that has come with The Book Thief, and I'm going to move it all onto this side, and I'm going to say, I'm betting that. And that's what made me, well, it nearly killed me writing the book, but it's also what made the book what it is, and it's what made me alive to write the book. And you're right. The one thing I say to people who want to be writers is, usually I'm very kind at first, and I just say, you're going to have bad days. You're going to have days, and I say, just take it easy on yourself those days. But at the same time, you have to cultivate an iron will that this is what you have to do, and this is what you have to prioritize. So the stubbornness involved in writing this book was something, and that kind of ridiculous optimism is what I needed.
I think many of the people here have probably read Book Thief. Other people are starting to maybe read Bridge of Clay. And while they're very, very different books, there were maybe 2 or 3 things where I felt that they converged for me. And I wanted your thoughts on that. The one is, first of all, is color. Book Thief begins with the line, first the colors, then the humans. That's usually how I see things. And here, too, we often hear about the light was aspirin white. This city, it was so hot and wide and white. The white and heavy light from the fridge. And I want you to talk a little bit about your relationship with color and its importance to you.
Yeah, I don't know, to tell you the truth. I think when I'm writing, I'm always seeing. I'm seeing. And that's what made me want to be a writer in the first place. Was I loved the magic act of you're reading a novel, and you know it's not true, but when you're in it, you believe it.
Right.
Yeah, and I thought, I want to be able to do that. And so I think it's one of the things that I've always connected with is I want to feel like I'm inside it. And I think that's why I've always described why I've been attracted to colour. And probably if you go back to my earlier books too, I'm sure it's present in there as well. And, you know, I guess in a lot of ways, I've always been a watcher of the sky. And so there are always, you know, there's the other line in Bridge of Clay when Penelope first shows up in Australia, the Dunbar's mother, and it says the sun was like a Viking, a barbarian in the sky. And that's what it does feel like at times. And even being in India with my wife, granted, I know it's winter at the moment, and you know, but what we notice when we go to other parts of the world is that the sun almost feels soft. And even it can be 29 degrees in Sydney, but you feel the sun like just
Burning.
eating into you. And so I think it's just in terms of the colour, I think what I'm looking for all the time is words, putting words together in a way, you know, and describing the world in a way that feels unusual and unique, but that we also kind of reminds us of something as well. And I think the colour is one of my attempts at doing that.
You know, because it's not just the strictly color, but there are some extraordinarily beautiful things where you bring up in the course of the book several times the wine dark seas from the Odyssey, you know, but then it flips around to being when you're talking about the wine dark toilet floor, and then one of the most poignant descriptions of someone dying and that sort of a lingering death from, say, cancer or something, which we all know, which you describe as no more wine dark sea, just a single boat gone rotten but unable to sink completely, which was just, you know, like really moving. And that brings me to that second point of convergence, which is about death. And of course, Book Thief is being narrated by death itself. But here too, death is very much a character. And I had marked out a little bit when the mother is dying in the book. And there's a little bit, you know, I'll just read it, where she, you know, it's just a very ordinary family scene. Everyone's in the kitchen. And then you realize that it's not going to be the same anymore. And said, but looking back now, it meant plenty. She'd started leaving us that morning, and death was moving in. He was perched there on a curtain rod, dangling in the sun. Later, he was leaning, close but casual, an arm draped over the fridge. If he was minding the beer, he was doing a bloody good job. Can we have a round of applause for that? Thank you.
I think what I'm doing and what you're describing there is I feel like even though this is a book about building a bridge, I still feel like I'm building all the time. In that case, I'm just building the images of death in the book. And it's very casual at first, sitting on a curtain rod with his legs dangling. Then he's got his arm around the fridge. Later, he's hanging from the power lines with the pigeons either side of him, almost kind of mockingly. And it comes, and they're always trying to stave death away. He's sort of making a little cameo appearance in this book, even though it's such the impending piece. And by the end, I think Matthew, the narrator, says, but now we realized in a way that we had it wrong, that we had done our best, but now death had so many gifts to give. And so I think what I'm doing all the time is I'm trying to build the language that way, that is constructing this world. And I always like the idea that it's not only fantasy writers who can build a world. You don't have to be Tolkien to build a world in a novel. And maybe I should have put a map at the start of this book, that of just that racing district where they live. And so, but I feel like my relationship to death, one of my favourite things is when people read The Book Thief and they come up to me afterwards and they say, after I read your book, I feel so much better about dying. And I say, I'm really happy for you. Because I don't feel that much better at all. And I think it was interesting hearing Dr. Ramakrishnan before, just thinking where people want you to have answers to things and expect you to have answers to things, but I'm still probably as terrified as death as I always have been. But I think it's just your subconscious, like the colours, and with death, it's you sit down to write and you become that other person that you are. You become somebody else, and I think that's what the attraction is. And we'll see what happens when I make it to death myself.
And is there a reason when you were saying about you just want to build piece by piece this world, almost brick by brick, and I was struck very much by how you use language in this book, because it's a lot of sentence fragments. It's almost like fragment by fragment, it builds up to something else. The words play over each other. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was very interested in repetition in this book, and I think the first thing that I should have said in the last question as well is that I think you're building it and building it and building it, and sometimes you need it to stay together. That's why you're building it. But sometimes you're building it to let it fall. And as it was in the case of that one with the idea of building the idea of death. And so in this case, I was interested in repetition because the Iliad and the Odyssey run through this book. And so that was why I was always looking for that idea of, okay, what's a repeated phrase that I'm going to use? So it's always in the beginning. It was this, or once in the tide of Dunbar passed, this happened. And to me, because I always want to feel like it's like in something tonight, or if I had to go and give a speech up there tonight, I would want you to feel like you're just sitting opposite me in my kitchen and we're just talking to each other. That's how I would like to talk to you. And so, and that was why there was that oral tradition of the Homeric tradition. And that was why I used those ideas. But I think that's how I like to write in general.
But speaking of the Iliad and the Odyssey, what did that Homeric tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey, represent for you, both in the story of Penelope, who is fleeing from behind the Iron Curtain, and then for this family of 5 boys being raised so far from that world in Australia, but still both tied together somehow by these Greek epics from an entirely different part of the world?
Yeah, I like the idea that there's always the unexpected, and I like the idea of, and it's sort of come to me here just from different audiences as well, where just the idea where someone asks, oh, it was quite amazing that you had this mother reading these Greek epics to her sons. I thought because, or the idea that music or classical music and art and books, they belong to the aristocracy, but here they're brought down to the working class level. And I think it's because art and music and books, I feel, are really democratic things, and that they can be your ticket to, I don't want to say salvation, but to freedom within yourself and to be who you are. I mean, I'm nothing without books. And so, but the first thing, and it's always what you don't expect and something small and not profound in any way, is that I came to the idea of using Homer through this book because I gave the boys nicknames. And it made me think of how in the Iliad and the Odyssey, Achilles is never just Achilles. He's the fast-running Achilles. Odysseus is the resourceful Odysseus. Laughter-loving Aphrodite, and so on. Hector, tamer of horses. And so I gave these boys these nicknames, and it started to make me interested. And then for whatever reason, I gave the pets the names Achilles, Agamemnon. And I knew there was a reason for it. And then I realised then it was Penelope came to Australia with a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I just like that idea that no one is exactly who you think they are. And these boys are not who you think they are. They're rough and they're coarse and they fight. But then they have an understanding of heroism and literature, and much as they would often deny that, that's something that they also love, and it's a part of who they are.
Well, their mother, Penelope, grows up behind the Iron Curtain in a house with 39 books. And I've read your mother came from Eastern Europe, and she didn't have very many books in her house.
No, she had no books in
No
her
books.
house, yeah.
How's that possible?
Maybe she was lying. No, she didn't have any books in her house. And I think that's because she came from a town and she was a foster child. And her foster parents were just very, rough kind of peasant type people who didn't. And so she clawed her way up, and ended up in Australia. And I think what she decided, and I think, and my dad as well, having immigrated both from Germany and Austria, that I think that like immigrants in that way, they want to empower their children. And one of the first ways was to have books in the house, to understand the language, to be good communicators, and knowing, again, that knowledge is the most important, gateway to where you need to go.
So what are the stories that you remember most from your parents?
Well, I'm being the youngest of 4 children. I'm spoilt in the way that I didn't get my parents' attention when I was very young, but when I was a teenager, I got to spend a lot of time with them because my 2 sisters had moved out. My brother wasn't interested in me or my parents or anyone else in our family. And so I went on long drives with my dad or bushwalks, and I went to work with my mum, and they told me their stories. And it was like if it was in our kitchen, so we played cricket in the backyard and football, but when my mum and dad told their stories, it was like a piece of Europe came into our house. And so I grew up with stories of, cities that were on fire while the ground was covered in ice. And already that story, or my mum would say, everything was frozen, but the sky was on fire. And you talk about the colours. I was always interested in opposites, I think, maybe because of that. And my dad would talk about having to go to the Hitler Youth when he was, or the young version of the Hitler Youth, and just saying, oh, it's bloody boring. I'm just going to go and throw rocks in the river instead. And so I heard stories of my dad's father, working for Jewish people in this town and being ostracised for that. And kids who would give bread to Jewish people and other so-called criminals while they were being taken away. Those were the stories I heard, and I would ask for them to be repeated. But I also want to be clear too that they never sat me down and said, now we're going to tell you something important. They still told me about, the guy who was the rudest guy in their town, or the one who, the guy who walked down the street whistling, and then they all called out to him, and then he would just swear at them, So there was always an element too of mischief in those stories, and I think that's also something that I don't always. It's not always present in a book, but there's always a little bit of mischief somewhere in what I do and how I write or how I use language as well.
Well, the stories is of course paramount, and that obviously binds all books together. More so where Book Thief is literally about somebody who is, stories being burnt, and then somebody who is stealing those stories back in a way. And here, this book is being written on a typewriter that has actually been buried along with a dog and a snake, but that's another story, as they say. So stories are obviously very important, and in the book, your Clay is saying he wants to make this one beautiful, perfect thing, which you said was the beginning of it. So before we open it out to questions, I'm going to ask you, if you wanted to make this one beautiful, perfect thing, would it be a book or would it be something else?
It would have to be a book because I'm not qualified to do anything else at all. And it would have to be a book. And I think that's one of the reasons it took 13 years to write this book, is that when you're writing about a character who is in pursuit of greatness and beauty and perfection, you feel like that's how you have to write, even though the whole idea is that Clay has to accept that there's a very strong chance that the miracle won't happen, or that he won't be great. And the actual greatness, and this is the beautiful irony, is that the only greatness in seeking out greatness is knowing that you can't be great, but trying anyway. So in a way, you're great before, just because of, the attempt. And in terms of that interweaving of stories, it's what I think if someone had to say, or someone asked, what is it that you love about being a writer or about being human, really, it's just that I'm one of the people who gets to have the job that recognizes that what we're made of. It's been really interesting having a molecular biologist and then me, is that, and I think it's what we're talking about with how things are made up, either in poetry or in factual science, is that I feel like what we're made of is stories. And stories are what make us who we are. And try to imagine your life without your stories. It's actually not a life at all. So to be here in Kolkata and to be talking to you, and we're having done such great research, it's just an honour to be here. And I hope this festival goes not only for another 8 or 9 years, but for another 80 or 90 years, if not longer. So thank you very much.
So thank you. Let's take a couple of questions. There's some hands up. So whoever gets a mic, please.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Yes. So what I wanted to ask was that your views on this motive of the absence and the void that there in both the books, when you have the Bridge of Clay and there's the absence of the father and the family is trying to raise itself. And in the Book Thief, you have these continuous absences and voids. And since it's Death who's narrating it, there's no sense of false hope or, positivity. There's a sense of gloom. But there's this girl, so many disasters in her life, absences, deaths, and she's building her life from there, which is a contrast to that backdrop of the Second World War, a destroyed nation. And if you could comment a little bit on that, and as you said, the idea of opposites really attracted you, and that contrast that happens.
Okay, that was great. I think there's got to be something at stake in a book. And in these cases, I don't know if I'll do it again, but with Liesl, I don't think you do these things on purpose. I think, like I said, you're searching, and then I remembered, one of the stories, and you asked about, what were some of the strongest memories of stories that I was told, is that, see, Liesl is 8 years old when she arrives in Molking. My mum was 3 years old when she was given up to foster parents, and the story she told me was how she held on to the front gate and she would not let go because she didn't want to go into that house. That's where it starts. It doesn't start with me saying, now I'm going to write a story about absence and death, and even coming to that idea, and that, finally being able to say that the Book Thief is about the fact that, in Nazi Germany, Hitler destroyed people with words, and Liesl is stealing the words back and writing a beautiful story with them, hopefully. I didn't start with that. It took me 10 years after the book was written to come to that realization. But it started with the girl hanging on the gate, and that's where you begin. And then all the love and distress and beauty and agony, that all gets worked in from that small detail and that moment, that precious moment, that begins a book. So I hope that made sense.
All right.
Good evening,
So-
Markus and Sandip. Good evening, Markus and Sandip. My name is Sudipto Ghosh. Could you share with us the story behind your becoming an author, taking up writing as a career?
Okay, so I was 16 years old when I decided I wanted to be a writer. I was almost like a villain in a movie where I thought, I'm going to be a writer and nothing is going to stop me. Nothing is going to stop me. And of course, then I tried to write. Well, then I wrote my first book, and all 8 pages of that could be entered into a competition for the worst book ever written. And it was awful. And I won't go step by step, but I wrote 3 manuscripts after that, and they were all 2 were rejected by many publishers, and then it was my 4th book that I had no hopes for that I sent to a publisher, and it was, I remember it was 2:20 in the morning, and I'd gone overseas for the first time, and I was in Vienna where my dad grew up, staying with his best friend, and the phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I knew, as soon as I heard the phone, I thought, and I'm not lying, I thought, that's my dad, and he's going to tell me, I think my book might be getting published, and it was true. And that had been 7 years of work. But I think the really important point to make about that is that even if it was going to take 70 years to write and get published, I would still be doing it. It's very easy for me to say that up here, but I think a writer always has to imagine that it could always end tomorrow. And if a ray of light came out of the sky and said to me, your next book will never see the light of day, it'll never get published, would I still write it? Would I have written The Book Thief or Bridge of Clay if they were never going to get published? I would have had to, obviously, I wouldn't have got the rewards, but I would have done it. So, but that's sort of the path of how I became a writer. It starts badly.
Sir,
Where
Yep.
are you?
Let's see where you
Sir.
are. Oh, yeah.
Hi, Markus. I'm Swati Lekha. I was just wondering that you, as a writer of The Book Thief, have you ever yourself stolen a book?
Have I stolen a book?
Yeah.
I think we're going to be here all night now because I haven't. This is one of the funniest things about The Book Thief is that every now and again someone makes the calculation, and especially someone who doesn't like the book, and they say, it's called The Book Thief and everything, but she only steals about 3 books or 4 books, and that always makes me laugh. But I have stolen a few books, usually inadvertently. I did steal a few books from my school library, which I still have. And you know why? It's because I didn't have my library card, and I thought I would bring the books back, but I never did. And then
You can gift them back now, now you're Marcus, and they'll be like, they'll be embossed and signed by you.
it was I think it would be fun to do that actually, and maybe I should. So, but I'll pick books up. Sometimes I'll see a book on the side of the road or in the median strip, and then I just turn around and I come and pick it up. And so basically, it's a policy of beg, borrow and steal when it comes to books. But I really don't like it when someone borrows a book off me and then never gives it back. That is a cardinal sin. And especially, we've got a really good friend who she does this, and she does it with DVDs as well. And then she will swear blue in the face that she already gave it back to you. She didn't give it back. There is no way she gave it back. I know because I'm guilty of doing it myself. And so it takes one to know one. So yes, I've stolen books, and you know what? I'm not ashamed.
Sir,
Yes.
The Bridge of Clay, as you said, took 13 years to write. So, sir, in the course of these 13 years, do you have any particular writing process that you follow? I mean, do you etch out your characters and major plot points, or is it just there and you just write spontaneously when it comes?
Okay, good question. I have very strict routines when I write, and so the process is very, I'm not going to say arduous, but it's very specific. And right down to the time I start writing. Sometimes I think I'm going to write from 7 in the morning till midday, and then The problem with that is, sometimes it'll hit 7:01 and you haven't started work, and then you say, oh, well, that's that day shot. I can't work today. And but what I do to plan a book is so The Book Thief is in 10 parts, Bridge of Clay is in 8 parts. And what I do is I will write part 1, cities, and then I'll write the chapter headings. And I'll do this over and over and over again. Even late last year when I was finishing, or mid last year when I was finishing Bridge of Clay, I was still writing out my chapter headings because I'm just getting every piece or every building block to fit into its right slot. So that's what I do. I sit down, I write my chapter headings out, and that way, if I haven't had a chance to write for a week or two, when I sit down, I write my chapter headings out and I can see the world of the book and I'm there. You always want to wake up in the morning and feel like the world of the book is next to you, and all you have to do is get out of bed and climb into it. And that's what the chapter headings do for me as I write them down. So that's how I plan a book.
We have time for one last question, so you're the lucky person. Go ahead.
Hello, Markus. I'm Srijita.
Hey.
My question to you is, from where you got the idea of representing death as a narrator in The Book Thief?
Okay, so I was writing with some kids at a school. There were 4 kids. They were the only kids in the entire school of about 1,000 who wanted to do a writing workshop. And I worked with them and I got them to write about colours, which is, interesting in light of what we've talked about tonight. And I gave them a first sentence. I can still remember what it was. It was, I've seen the colour of time on 3 occasions. Possibly the worst first sentence ever conceived. And but I got them to write it. And then I wrote with them. And what I can go into the very specific details. I wrote about 3 deaths. I don't know why. It was just what came out. One was a death and I used the colour red. One was the colour white and one was the colour blue. I still remember the blue one, and it was at the ocean. And then I just thought, honestly, I thought death was the narrator of these stories. I might put it in that book set in Nazi Germany. And for the first time I wrote the prologue, it talks about the red sky and the white snow and the black signature of the sky. And so that gave me the Nazi flag. But for the first couple of, year or so when I was writing The Book Thief, it was red, white and blue. And it took finally I just went, why am I keeping it blue? Why am I keeping it blue? So it was using death, and I just thought it always attracted me. It made me excited to write that every day. And then I had all sorts of problems with death as the narrator, which I won't go into too much. But now I just see it. There was a time, the last thing I will say is, there was a time where I scrapped death as the narrator of The Book Thief, and I had Liesl tell the story. And then Liesl didn't work, so I scrapped her, and then it was just a third-person narration. The best decision I ever made with that book was to go back to using death as the narrator.
We have a bonus. I've been allowed one more question, so somebody's going to get very, very lucky. So one last question.
Hello.
There's someone. Oh,
Yeah.
Hello.
yes.
Good evening. I was wondering that in the last part of The Book Thief, when Death meets Liesl, and he gives her the book, and he says that this is the book about her. So will there ever be a sequel when we get to know what happened to Max and how he came back and traced back Liesl, and what happened to Liesl?
This is one of those categorical questions that I can answer 100%. And I don't know if you're going to like it or not, but I'll never write a sequel to The Book Thief. And it's purely because once it was funny, a lady came up to me after a book event. We talk about the 580 pages, and she said, I was wondering what happened between the end of the war and then when we see Liesl so much later on when she died. Why didn't you write that? And I said to her, how long did you want the book to be? Did you want it to be 800,000 pages? And but The Book Thief is a special book. And what I mean is, I'm not saying it's a great book. It's a special book in that it's had a special life. It's had a lucky life. It's just got a little bit of magic sprinkled over it that has given it readers like you, and that has led me here to Kolkata. It's just a lucky book. And I think people have taken that book to their hearts, and I would never want to sacrifice that bit of magic by trying to replicate it and by writing a sequel. I think it just needs to sit exactly how it is and where it is, and let it keep living that kind of life. So thank you.
Oh, this is a great lucky day. I've been given a chance for a couple more questions. So who's it going to be?
Maybe everyone's had enough.
One. But I know there was some.
Yeah,
So
there's
put your
one at
hand
the
up.
back,
I think
there
there's
are a
a
few
there.
hands couple of
Yeah,
hands.
hello.
Yeah. Hi.
Yep. Hi.
I just wanted to ask, when you started writing The Messenger, how much clarity did you have on how the book was going to flow out?
Okay, so The Messenger was the book before The Book Thief, and that book started because, and I can't even take the credit for it, where my wife and I, we were sitting outside a bank in a small town called Kiama outside of Sydney, and there was, in the bank outside, it said there was parking, and it was a 15-minute parking zone, and my wife said to me, 15 minutes doesn't seem like very long. What if you were in that bank when it was getting robbed and your car was out in the 15-minute parking zone? How would you get out to move your car in time to not get a fine? And that was purely how that book started. But I didn't have too much mapped out with that book. I wrote the first part, and then I would sit down and I'd plan the second part. And then I'd sit down and write the third part, but I knew how it was going to end. And so The Messenger was one of those books. The first chapter of that book wrote itself. It's the only chapter like that I've ever had. But my favourite character in that book was always the dog, the doorman. And he came from a failed project, a book that didn't work. I only wrote 10 or 20 pages, and I just moved him from that book into this one to where he actually belonged.
And on that note, we are going to have to end this session. Please join me in thanking Markus for spending this evening with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
He will be signing books out there, so if you had the burning question you didn't get to, you can ask him there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Sandip. And yes, for those burning questions and those books which need to be signed, please head to the Story bookstore. We need 2 minutes to set up.